Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. There's a kind of silence in solitary that doesn't exist anywhere else. It isn't peace. It's not stillness. It's something colder. Something that presses against the inside of your skull and stretches out the hours until they don't mean anything. You stop counting the days by lights or meals. You count by slower things. The way mold creeps down a wall tile. The sound of the toilet flushing weaker each time. How long it takes the rust to stain the corners of your sink orange. Blackridge didn't announce the end of the world. There were no alarms. No guards pounding down the corridor. No lights strobing red and white. Just absence. A soft and steady failure of everything familiar. And when the routine dies in a place like this, when the guards start skipping shifts and doors stop locking on time, you don't need a memo to know something outside went wrong. They put me in solitary 11 months before the system cracked. That wasn't the plan. I wasn't sentenced to isolation. They threw me there after the riot in the special control zone, a wing built for people like me, the manipulators, the ones who whispered the right things to the wrong people, too dangerous to sit in Gen Pop, too calm to be broken. I had a reputation. I made calls without raising my voice. I organized a full power shift with no contraband and no body count, until it failed. Someone flipped. The guards came down like hammers. 2 inmates disappeared. A few others got shipped out in chains. They dropped me in a reinforced steel box the size of a walk-in freezer and left the lights on just to see if I'd crack. They thought I was a fuse waiting to blow, so they locked me away like a threat they could forget. Before that, I had been at Blackridge for almost 5 years. Life without parole. My name isn't important now. Maybe it never was. But the things I did to get here matter. The court said I was responsible for one of the most violent civilian incidents in Florida's recent history. February 2nd, 3 years before everything collapsed, I led a coordinated armed robbery at a billionaire's private estate during a fundraising gala in Coconut Grove. Gabriel Reigns, real estate king, political backers in DC, deep pockets in tech and oil. The event was full of people who weren't supposed to bleed. Senators, foreign investors, some alphabet agency types off-duty. I planned it for efficiency, intimidation, control. No one was supposed to die. But DeMarco snapped during the takedown. He saw something. Someone reached for a phone maybe. And he started shooting. That broke everything. Chaos exploded like a bomb. 23 people went down. 2 kids, 3 guards, a pair of diplomats. Reigns' daughter. The floor looked like a surgical table flipped upside down. Our window to escape vanished with the gunfire, and so did our cover. The feds descended faster than I thought possible. When they caught me, I didn't say a word, but my crew did. Every single one of them flipped, put it all on me to save themselves. They needed a face to pin it on, and I had one the press would eat up. They sent me to Blackridge Penitentiary, a fortress of steel and concrete sitting on the bones of an old naval base off the Maine coastline. The public barely knew it existed. Those who did assumed it housed people like me because there was nowhere else safe enough. You could smell salt in the air sometimes when the vents cycled. Other days it just smelled like wet stone and mildew. Time didn't flow here. It dripped. The guards were mostly ex-military, the kind of men who got off on quiet compliance. And those of us who pushed back didn't last long. For the first few years, I worked my way through the system, made alliances, controlled small trades, ran protection. Inmates respected strength, and I had no shortage of it when it came to breaking jaws or cracking ribs with a glance. But real power was control, and I started organizing. That's what led to the riot. We weren't trying to escape, just change the order. New leadership. The old gang leaders had grown soft. A few guards died in the chaos. One inmate ended up hanging by a bedsheet. The administration crushed it hard. I was pulled from the tier, beaten half-conscious in the showers, and dragged to solitary B4. They left me there and forgot me. 4 walls, no window, 1 drain, 1 steel tray slot. The light flicked on at 6 and off again 12 hours later. Some days they forgot, or maybe they didn't care. I stopped tracking. The only sound most nights was the hum of the overhead bulb and my own thoughts scraping against the walls. I stopped talking out loud after the first month. What was the point? I didn't mark the exact day things stopped running right, but it wasn't long after I noticed the tray schedule slipping. The first time, breakfast came an hour late. That happened sometimes. Shift changes, fog delays on the ferry, but not often. Then the dinner tray skipped altogether. I pounded the hatch. Nothing. Next morning, a different guard walked the hall. Older guy, balding, thick glasses, skin pale from indoor light. One of the types who usually avoided eye contact. That day, he stopped outside my door. Didn't open it. Didn't speak at first. Just stood there like he wasn't sure he wanted to say anything. Then he slid the tray in slower than usual. It wasn't the usual contents. No starch, no processed meat. Just a sealed bag of dry oats, a bottle of water, and a peanut butter packet from the commissary shelf. I looked at it, then back at the slot. "This might be the last one," he said. His voice wasn't calm, but it wasn't panicked either. More like resignation. "No more shipments. If you want to stretch it, eat slow. Save the water. Nothing's coming in." Before I could respond, he was already walking down the hall. I never saw him again. The next few days felt hollow. No sound in the pipes. No buzz of fluorescent lights kicking on overhead. The whole block had gone soft around the edges, like the walls were sagging under their own weight. Meals didn't come. Lights stayed dim. Even the recycled air vents started pushing less. It wasn't just abandonment. Something was dying. I rationed what I had. Ate the oats dry, a pinch at a time. Took sips of water, never a full gulp. Sleep came harder with the hunger. I spent long hours lying on the steel bunk with my eyes open, ears tuned to anything. Mostly, there was nothing. Then, one night, could have been day for all I knew, I heard something that didn't fit. Not the shuffle of boots or the buzz of keys. It started as distant shouting, carried through the air duct system. Not the tough guy kind inmates used to posture, but frantic, broken. Two voices, male, overlapping in panic. One barked something about containment. The other screamed for backup. Then a pop, short, flat, maybe a 9mm. Someone fired a shot, probably a sidearm. What followed wasn't silence. It was worse. There was a dragging sound, long, rhythmic, rubber soles scraping concrete, then a metallic slam. After that, nothing. The silence that followed felt different, not just empty, it was final, like whatever system had been holding this place together finally gave up. By the 12th day, the water from the sink had thinned to a dribble. I caught every drop in the peanut butter packet, used a strip of shirt to wipe moisture off the sink edge and suck it through my teeth. The toilet stopped flushing by the 15th. First, it burbled. Then came a gurgling sound from the pipe below. Then it stopped entirely. I poured in part of my remaining water just to keep the smell down. It was somewhere around the 20th day that the light overhead began to blink out randomly. Flickers at first, like it was struggling to decide whether it was needed. Eventually, it gave up. I sat in the dark for hours at a time. Days, maybe. Everything blurred together after that. I started thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years. Faces from before prison, old jobs, the crew, the betrayal. What I would have done different. What I would have done worse. By what I guessed was the 28th day, I hadn't eaten in a week. My water had run dry 3 days earlier. My breath was sour with nothing behind it. I lay on the floor, eyes half closed, when I heard it. A click. Not a distant slam or an echo through the duct. This one was close, mechanical, metal on metal. I turned my head and looked at the door. The lock had disengaged. The bolt slid back with a soft clunk. The door cracked an inch on its track, then stopped. Nothing else happened. No voice, no footstep, no explanation. After 5 full minutes, I stood, cracked my joints, and pushed it open the rest of the way. The air in the hall was stale. The emergency lights had switched to low output red, A haze hung in the air, like dust stirred up from long dormancy. The other cells were empty or locked. No voices, no other inmates shouting. One of the doors had been cracked from the inside. Brown stains smeared the interior wall. Something dark and dry curled up in the corner, just out of view. I didn't check it. I found my way to the guard station at the end of the hall. No one inside. One of the monitors was still running on battery backup, showing static. The others were black. A half-eaten stale sweet roll sat on the desk next to an overturned chair. Dust ringed the surface like it had been undisturbed for days. Maybe longer. I found a maintenance ring on the hook beside the security locker. Took it. Not because I needed it then, but because I knew what came next. When systems fall, tools become power, keys more than anything. The door to the stairwell was open. Someone had forced it earlier. Marks on the latch showed it had been pried with a crowbar or pipe. I descended slowly, passing empty corridors and unlocked gates. No buzzers, no alarms. Blackridge was wide open. Down on level 2, past the old special control zone, I saw the first real sign of collapse. A guard's body lay halfway in a doorway, shirt soaked in something dry and dark. No wounds on the surface, but his face told the story. Wide eyes, blood dried under the nose, mouth twisted in a snarl like he'd seen death and tried to scream it away. I stepped over him and moved on, cautiously, always keeping corners in sight. The cafeteria was cold and stripped bare, chairs overturned. One table blackened from fire damage. Someone tried to cook something here, on a tray using wire and old paper. Desperation makes engineers out of anyone. I reached cell block C by sunset, or what I guessed was sunset by the red lights dimming. That's when I heard voices again. Real ones. Movement down the far hall. 2 inmates, skinny, slow, limping. One held a broken metal bar, the other a shard of glass tied to a belt. They weren't together by choice. They were together by fear. I didn't let them see me. Not yet. I wanted to know what kind of world I was walking into. I tailed them through the processing hallway and saw what was left of Blackridge's order. Barricades made of overturned bunk frames, fires in garbage cans, strips of uniforms used as bandages. Some of it looked recent, but most of it had the feel of rot, like it had been thrown together in the panic of a single night and never fixed afterward. Doors propped open with broken mop handles, lockers smashed, burned corners from something they tried to torch and failed to control. There were no guards, no authority, just silence and shadows. And for all my hard edges, I wasn't ready for that kind of quiet. Not after 11 months in a cage with nothing but the buzz of flickering lights and the rattle of meal trays to keep time. My body was failing me. That was the first real truth I had to accept. The adrenaline of freedom had burned fast, and now the weight of starvation was pressing down like wet concrete. I could barely stand without leaning against the wall. My hands trembled when I gripped the broken mop handle I'd pulled from the janitor closet. More a splintered stick than a weapon. My skin felt tight across my ribs, and my vision blurred if I moved too fast. I followed the 2 men through the wreckage of the processing wing, not too close, not too far. Just enough to see that they were alert but not organized. They were scavenging, not patrolling, probably looking for food or batteries, or one of the few things that still had value when the lights went out. One of them walked with a limp, the other had his head on a swivel. Both of them were armed, but poorly, shanks made from toothbrushes and bolts tied together with torn undershirts. That told me enough about their mental state. You didn't carry garbage like that unless you expected to use it, and expected it to break. I waited until they passed into the old visitation hallway, then took a different path toward the lower cells of Block C. It was one of the older parts of the prison, never fully modernized, and its design hadn't changed much since the 60s. Rows of double-tier cells with heavy sliding bars and manual locks. A central guard station shaped like an octagon. A few long metal benches in the common area, now covered in ashes. The smell hit me first. Something between mold, urine and blood. Not fresh, but not old enough to be forgotten. The lights overhead were dead, but I caught a faint orange flicker coming from the far end. Emergency lanterns, or maybe a trash fire. I made my way through the central corridor, slow and low, the mop handle resting against my shoulder like a crutch. I hadn't eaten in what felt like weeks. My stomach had stopped complaining days ago. Now it just folded in on itself like paper. I stepped into one of the side bathrooms and leaned against the sink to catch my breath. Cold tile, cracked mirror, busted soap dispenser. A cockroach scuttled into the drain as I breathed through my nose and tried to slow the shaking in my hands. That's when I heard the stall door creak open behind me. He came out barefoot, shirtless, and wide-eyed. His skin was pale and clammy, and he mumbled something I couldn't make out. He didn't look like he'd eaten either, but his eyes burned with something else. Frenzy, confusion, maybe desperation. I raised the mop handle between us without a word. He kept walking, then running. I swung with everything I had. The stick connected with his shoulder, but it wasn't clean. He slammed into me, and we hit the tile together. I felt the air leave my chest as I landed, ribs screaming. He clawed at my face, tried to bite my jawline, his breath hot and sour like rot. I jabbed the stick into his side and rolled, kicking off the wall with what little strength I had left. We tumbled again, and this time I ended up on top, knees pinning his ribs. I didn't hesitate. I drove the stick into his neck again and again, wood splintering as I forced it down. He gasped once, wet and ragged, and then went limp. I stayed on him longer than I needed to. Not because I wasn't sure he was dead, because I couldn't get up. My arms trembled from the effort, and I realized then that if he'd been even slightly stronger, I'd be dead. I collapsed next to the body, breathing through clenched teeth, sweat cold against my back. I didn't know what was wrong with him. He wasn't just a man going mad. There was something else. After a long rest, I pulled myself up using the sink and looked around. The stall he'd come out of was smeared with something dark. Blood maybe, feces. A rotted jumpsuit lay on the floor beside a used syringe. Maybe drugs had cooked his brain, maybe hunger. But he didn't look like he was dying. He looked like he'd already died, and no one told him to stop moving. I left the bathroom and staggered into the cell block proper. The air felt colder there, thinner, like the building was holding its breath. I saw signs of life. A pair of candles melted onto the concrete bench. A half-empty can of beans resting beside a tin cup. Some footprints in the dust leading toward the north side tier. I followed them. My grip on the mop handle was loose now, hands blistered from the earlier fight. At the top of the tier, in the guard station that overlooked Cell Block C, I finally saw people. 4 of them, huddled around a battery-powered lantern, arms tense, eyes sharp. One had a sharpened rebar rod, the others held makeshift blades. They spotted me immediately and raised their weapons. I didn't move. I raised one hand slowly. "I'm not with anyone," I rasped. "Got out of solitary 2 days ago. Haven't eaten in a week. Just looking to breathe somewhere without a knife in my back." That line bought me a pause. One of them, a thin older man with long dreadlocks and a nasal scar, stepped forward. He had a knife made from a snapped pair of scissors wrapped in gauze. "You killed the screamer down by the washroom?" I nodded. He eyed me for a moment, then lowered the blade. "He turned last week. Wasn't the first. Won't be the last. Come sit, but don't touch anything." I lowered myself to the floor, back against the wall, grateful just to be near light. One of them handed me something wrapped in paper and said I could eat it. I ate it in 3 bites. Didn't ask for more. "What the hell happened?" I asked. "Why's the place empty?" The man with the dreadlocks lit a cigarette with a match pulled from his sock. He exhaled slowly and said, "It's not just the prison. It's everywhere. Something got into the food chain, or water. Depends who you ask. People started acting sick, then feral, then dead, then not dead anymore." Another man chimed in, younger, jittery. "Some of them bite. That's how it spreads. You get bit, you don't die clean. You twitch, then turn, then you bite someone else." I stared at the concrete floor, the weight of the words pressing down like fresh iron. I had thought Blackridge was alone in its collapse. Maybe a riot gone too far, some kind of breakdown in communication. But this was worse. "Why didn't they evacuate us?" I asked. The dreadlocked man looked at me without blinking. because we're the last people anyone wanted to save. I sat in silence after that, letting their words settle. I didn't ask names. Neither did they. The rules were different now. Trust didn't come cheap, but survival didn't either. We stayed close to the guard station for the next 2 days. The lantern flickered every few hours, running on its last set of backup batteries. Nobody talked unless it was necessary. There was nothing left to say. The only real task that mattered was eating, drinking, and keeping watch. 3 things that required constant vigilance. I was given a corner by the far window, a torn wool blanket, and a half can of beans per day. It was enough to stop the trembling in my arms, enough to get my legs working again. My strength returned like a wound closing slowly, uneven, tight, painful, but functional. I spent those early hours listening to the way they talked when they forgot I was there. One of them said the infection started on the outside months ago, spreading in waves through food distribution networks. Another claimed the guards here were ordered to stay and quarantine the prison, but started deserting when supplies stopped coming from the mainland. Nobody knew who gave the final order, if there even was one. But at some point, command fell apart. The radio died, and Blackridge was left to rot on its own. Once I could stand for more than an hour at a time, I went back to the place that had caged me. Solitary wing, level 3. I told no one where I was going, took the mop handle with me, and moved quiet. It felt wrong stepping back into that cold hallway, like returning to the site of a crime you weren't finished committing. The security door had been jammed open with a bench leg. The floors were streaked with dirt, dried blood, and broken glass. The stench was sharper now, like something sweet left too long in the sun. Halfway down the row, I saw the body of a guard slumped against a control panel. Dried vomit crusted on his shirt. His radio was clipped to his belt, battery missing. Looked like he'd died sitting up, hand still curled around a half-empty bottle of pills. On the wall behind him, someone had written 3 words in black marker. Nobody is coming. My old cell was still open. B4. I stepped inside. The cot was stripped. The walls were damp with mildew. A small rat darted out from under the slab when I kicked it gently. No ghosts here. Just silence. I stood there for a moment and let the memory pass. Then I turned and walked out without looking back. I made my way toward the general population wings, trying to trace who had control and who was pretending. The farther I moved from the guard station, the more chaotic things became. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it crude symbols from prison gangs, others more recent and manic. The doors to the medical unit were sealed shut with wire and duct tape. A message scrawled in red marker across the glass read, "Don't open, turned inside." Cell Block C was the only area that still showed signs of structure. About 20 inmates remained scattered across the upper tiers, most of them holed up in their old cells. They'd created a loose perimeter of overturned benches, stacked boxes, and makeshift alarm systems, empty cans strung on string. Not for guards. Not anymore. Something worse. They let me pass without much resistance. My reputation hadn't been forgotten. Even after a year off the grid, a name still meant something in here. One man watched me the whole way in. Big, sharp eyes. He didn't move like the others. He was clean too, relatively speaking. Muscles still intact. Dreadlocks pulled back tight. He stood on the second tier near a battery lantern and sharpened a piece of steel against the edge of a utility box. I knew him by sight before he spoke. Harris, used to run drugs through the laundry before the riot. Never the top dog, but always hungry. The kind of man who waits for the storm to blow over and then claims to have been in charge all along. "You look like hell," he called down. "Guess the rumors were true. They cracked the tomb and let the ghost out." I didn't smile, just stepped forward and let my eyes wander the camp he'd built. A fire pit of scorched metal in the middle, crates of canned food stacked against the rec room door, bedding made from ripped uniforms and curtain rods. He had 6 men posted across the area, all armed with scrap metal, plastic tubing, and broken kitchen tools, a militia of scavengers. "You running this place?" I asked. "I'm keeping it breathing," he said, "more than you can say for the rest of this ghost ship." He came down the metal stairs and stopped about 10 feet from me. No fear in his step, but no recklessness either. The man had survived this far for a reason. "Place needs a voice," he said. "Might as well be one that still has both eyes and no fever." He said it with confidence, but it was half performed. He knew I wasn't here to chat. "I don't want to talk," I said. "You want to run things? You show me why you're worth following." He smirked, lifted his blade slightly, and gave a theatrical little bow. "You want to test me? Be my guest." I didn't wait. I lunged before the others could even step in. My arm was still sore, but adrenaline dulled the pain. The mop handle caught him in the ribs and drove him back. He staggered, adjusted, swung for my face with the metal shard. It clipped my cheek and tore skin. I ducked low, swept his legs with the mop handle, and sent him to the floor. He rolled fast and got up, but he was off balance now. I didn't let him recover. Slammed the end of the handle into his collarbone, then into his stomach. He gasped and dropped to one knee. That's when I ripped the pipe from his hand and shoved it against his throat. I didn't crush it, just enough pressure to hold him there. He didn't resist, just stared at me, eyes full of bitter calculation. I looked around at the others. No one moved to stop me. No one moved at all. "New rules," I said, standing tall. "No hoarding, no cowardice. You work, you eat. You fight me, you bleed. This is my block now. Anyone got a problem with that? Speak now." Nobody spoke. I let Harris drop and stepped away. He didn't get back up right away, just coughed into the floor and wiped blood from his lip. That was how it began. In the hours that followed, I walked the perimeter and assigned jobs. 2 to watch the entrances, 1 to start boiling water with what little fuel remained, the rest to inventory food. I took the second-tier cell with the widest view, not because it was comfortable, but because it gave me line of sight over everyone. We had no heat, no running water, no electricity beyond 2 salvage batteries, but we had a roof, walls, and doors that locked. That alone made it worth defending. It was still just 1 block, and it was still on the edge of collapse. But now it had order, even if that order came from fear. That night, as I sat on the bunk and listened to the creaking of the prison around me, I thought about the man I'd killed in the bathroom and the others who would follow. Some out of madness, some out of fear, some because that's all they had left. There's a moment in every survival scenario where the weak start looking for someone to follow. In prison, it doesn't take long. We were 30 days past the collapse, though I didn't know it at the time, and the men around me were already dividing into 2 kinds. Those who obeyed out of instinct and those who obeyed out of caution. The trick was never to let either type believe obedience was optional. I ran Cell Block C like a chain of command. No favors, no discussions. Every man got a task: scouting, boiling water, inventory, lookouts, and every task came with a timeline. If someone failed to deliver, there were no second warnings. The first time, I beat a hoarder until his teeth broke. The second, I starved a thief for 3 days and made him watch the others eat. The third time, I cut a coward's hand open with the same piece of pipe he used to fake patrol duty and made him clean the floor with it. After that, the mistakes stopped. We had no electricity outside a few patched-together systems in the guard station and the kitchen. 2 of the inmates were ex-maintenance workers. One did electrical, the other HVAC. I gave them extra food and first pick of the sleeping quarters if they could get anything running. Within 2 weeks, they restored backup lighting to the main block corridor using deep cycle batteries pulled from the generator bay near the delivery dock. That gave us flickering yellow strips in the halls and enough juice to charge 2 radios. Both radios were silent, but their blinking lights made men believe we were doing something more than waiting to die. On day 42, we mapped the entire first floor. No infected, just the dead. Most were guards. A few inmates who'd bled out in their cells, still strapped down or tucked in the corners like they thought the chaos wouldn't reach them. I found one in the laundry room, half his face missing. The door was locked from the inside. I never opened it, just left him there with the washer still full of dried uniforms. The only area we avoided was the tunnel that led to the psychiatric wing. Nobody wanted to go near it. The stories from the first days were always the same. Screams from the floor drains, thumping through the walls, someone hammering on the old vents. I didn't push for it yet. Not because I was afraid, because I understood timing. I ran the mess hall like a currency exchange. All food went through me. Each man got 2 meals per day, measured, consistent, and public. You skipped a shift, your meal went to the next man. That kind of redistribution kept the dangerous ones from acting out. Nobody wants to get stabbed over a can of peaches, but they'll stab you to keep eating them tomorrow. We found 2 working water filters in the infirmary and moved them to the rec area. Built a crude filtration system from old charcoal and sandbags. Still tasted like copper, but it kept us alive. I made sure the first cups went to me and the men I trusted. It wasn't about ego, it was about demonstration. Everyone had to see who held the chain. By day 70, we controlled all 4 tiers of Cell Block C, the cafeteria, the eastern showers, and half of the gymnasium. The other blocks were sealed, full of rot and things we couldn't yet explain. I started organizing push teams, small groups of 3 with one goal: reclaim territory. I led the first one myself. We went into Block B with nothing but crowbars and flashlights. Found 2 dead guards barricaded inside the warden's office, their heads caved in. A half-empty shotgun rested in a corner with 3 shells left. I took it. That same day, we discovered a storage room with untouched emergency rations. 17 cases of dried food, vacuum sealed, enough for a month. I ordered it moved piece by piece into a hidden cell on the 2nd tier and didn't tell anyone where the rest went. That was my insurance. In the new world, knowledge and calories were the same thing. It was on day 77 that the first real fracture appeared. Harris, the same man I'd knocked down in front of everyone, began organizing in secret. I saw it before it happened. Late-night whispers, food disappearing in small amounts, men doing favors without telling me why. He tried to build a council, said leadership had to be shared, that the world had ended, and now we needed democracy. I waited until his little movement peaked, let him believe he had momentum. Then I had him dragged into the laundry, tied to the pipe by his wrists, and left there for 12 hours without food or water. I brought the others in one by one and made them watch as I pulled a confession out of him with a length of rubber hose and a belt looped around his neck. He gave up 3 names. All 3 were removed from duty and stripped of food rations for a week. Harris didn't speak again after that. He walked with a limp and stopped making eye contact. That was enough. By day 85, the structure held. Men followed the rotation schedules. Fights still happened, but they were rare and fast. Anyone caught stealing, hoarding, or skipping watch duty was brought to me. I made examples carefully. Enough blood to send a message, never enough to empty the roster. Fear was leverage, but it had to be dosed right. Then came the expansion. On day 100, I gave the order to breach the tunnel to the west block. It had been sealed with rebar and loose concrete back during the first wave of collapses. Took 3 hours with chisels and a jack handle to open it. We entered slow, with fire and noise. Let anything waiting know we weren't prey. That's where we saw them. The infected weren't rotting husks like in the movies. They looked human, just wrong. Faces slack, movements twitchy. One of them still wore a kitchen apron from the old prep wing, crusted in dried blood. They didn't run or charge. They just turned, opened their mouths, and let out this low sound, like a man trying to scream through water. We killed 2 of them with blunt force. The third one tried to bite Juno, one of my runners. Took a hunk out of his shoulder before we bashed its head in. Juno didn't make it through the night. He started shaking around midnight. By sunrise, his veins were black and he couldn't speak. We tied him down and watched. 12 hours later, he stopped moving. Another 6, and he got back up. We put a crowbar through his skull. That was the rule from then on. Bite equals death. Anyone hiding a bite would be executed on sight. There were no second opinions, no medical appeals. You bled wrong, you died fast. By day 110, we had cleared blocks A through E. The psychiatric wing remained sealed, but the rest of Blackridge was ours. We controlled the infirmary, the generator deck, the supply docks, and the North Tower. Our crew numbered 27. I kept 7 armed and posted at all times. The others worked shifts, cleaned, scouted, cooked, and maintain perimeter watch. The fences still held. The dock was quiet. The sea hadn't risen yet. Inside these walls, I was the system. There was no one left to answer to. No one left to stop me. We controlled the halls, the food, the water, and the doors. I had eyes on every tier, ears in every shadow. The infected outside the psychiatric wing kept their distance for now, and anyone who dared to test my rules inside had either submitted or stopped breathing. But the pressure never let up. Every day was a ration to count, a pair of boots to track, a rusting pipe to patch. No calendar, no schedule, just survival, measured in fuel and calories. By day 130, we had begun sending scouting teams deeper into the utility levels, the maintenance crawlways, basement storerooms, the old tunnels near the east loading dock. Half of Blackridge had been sealed off during the outbreak, doors welded shut, signs scrawled in permanent marker. Sick inside, no access, last out, lock it. Nobody knew what was behind most of them, but we needed answers. More than that, we needed food. That morning, I sent a 3-man crew, Myers, Rook, and Teal, down through the sub-level corridor that led to the original food distribution chambers. It hadn't been used in over a year, long before the collapse. Old rumors said it was where the bulk dry goods were stored when the prison still had a dedicated kitchen staff. I gave them 2 hours. If they didn't come back, we'd mark it red and torch the tunnel. They returned in 90 minutes, winded and wide-eyed, hauling a broken pallet cart and dragging 2 people behind them. They weren't inmates. One was a pale, bearded man with hollow cheeks and dark rings under his eyes. The other was a woman, maybe mid-40s, clutching a dented saucepan like it was a shield. Both wore torn kitchen uniforms, the old Blackridge logo still visible under the grime. They were too thin to run and too scared to speak. When we brought them up into the light, they squinted like animals pulled from a cellar. According to Teal, they'd found them hiding behind a collapsed storage rack inside the bulk freezer chamber. They'd barricaded themselves in with shelving, plastic wrap, and pallets, survived on old dry rice, canned corn, and water siphoned from the freezer drip system. They'd been down there since the 2nd week of the outbreak. That meant they'd lived through the worst of the collapse, alone and underground, while the rest of us clawed for control up here. I ordered them separated and interrogated, gently at first. If they were playing dumb or hiding infection, I'd know by the end of the day. The man's name was Shaw. He used to work night prep. The woman was named Belle, short for Isabel. She'd managed dry storage and inventory before everything fell apart. Their stories matched. The day the doors slammed shut, they'd been prepping for a new food delivery. Then the guards stopped showing up. Screaming started. Power failed. They barricaded the door from the inside and didn't come out. When I asked why they hadn't tried to escape, Belle just looked at me and said, "We figured the prison was safer than the world outside, and it wasn't safe in here." I believed them. They weren't lying. They were too broken for that. Their knowledge was valuable, too valuable to ignore. They knew where the food had been stored before distribution was shut down. They knew how to restart the kitchen systems, how the plumbing routes worked, which pipes were still clean, and what rooms hadn't been looted. More than that, they knew how to stretch rations like professionals. Bell had run food logistics for 2 decades before taking the Blackridge job. Shaw had worked 3 hurricane seasons in Louisiana shelters. These were people who knew how to survive with 1 burner and a pile of beans. I gave them a trial job, clean and catalog the remaining food in Block D's prep station. I assigned 2 armed guards to watch them, rotate every 6 hours. No contact with the others. No special treatment. Just work. If they played straight, they'd eat like the rest of us. If they tried anything else, the walls would swallow them. They understood. 2 days later, they delivered a list of inventory that changed everything. In a hidden storeroom near the bottom of the freezer hallway, behind a fake wall panel Shaw had helped install years ago, they'd found 2 locked food crates, one full of vacuum-sealed protein pouches, the other packed with powdered milk, oats, and freeze-dried soup mix. Military surplus. It had never been opened. Neither had the door on the old walk-in freezer itself, which miraculously still held temperature due to its double insulated walls and low ambient temp from the foundation level. I immediately dispatched a work team to inspect the freezer, assess structural damage, and begin rewiring the power couplings. I wasn't expecting a miracle, but if we could get that freezer online again, even for a few hours a day, we could extend the life of what we had by months. And that's when I realized what I had. Food. Food was power, the last real currency. Fuel could be rationed. Weapons could be sharpened. But food couldn't be cheated. You either had it or you didn't. And now we had more than anyone else. I moved the main food stores from the rec room to the sealed cell in Tier 2 and doubled the guards on it. Posted a rotating watch inside the kitchen, installed locks on the doors, and gave the keys only to me and my second. Even the guards had to request meals. No one touched a can without approval. Discipline changed overnight. The worst troublemakers vanished from the rotation lists. Men started following orders without reminders. Fights over bedding stopped. Fights over food didn't, because now there was something to lose. I gave Belle full control over the kitchen and prep areas. Shaw became her assistant. She answered to me directly. If anything went missing, I'd know. If she failed, she died. She understood the stakes. To tighten the structure further, I drew a new map of the prison's interior, labeled and coded every section. The kitchen became Red Zone 1, the infirmary, Red Zone 2, the food stores, Red Zone 3. No entry without escorts, no excuses. Anyone caught snooping or lying about their assignments was brought to me. 2 men tested it. One tried to steal protein powder. The other tried to bribe a kitchen runner. Both were caught. One lost 3 fingers. The other disappeared into the tunnels. By day 140, Blackridge had changed. It was no longer a ruin held together with wire and spit. It was a fortress, and I was its spine. The infected still prowled beyond the psychiatric wing, and we still heard distant pounding from time to time. Vent grates shaking, floor drains echoing, but inside our perimeter there was order. Rigid, brutal, but alive. Most of Blackridge had been brought under control. The blocks were locked down. The cafeteria, infirmary, and filtration systems were under guard. Food was managed. Work was constant. No one had illusions about comfort, but they stopped asking questions and started moving when I told them to. That was the rhythm we needed. Still, it wasn't enough. We were running out of propane, threadbare on antibiotics, and down to our last few usable blades. The maintenance teams were patching rust with plastic trays and stripping copper from walls just to keep the lights running. The rainwater catchment system we rigged on the roof barely gave a gallon a day. I knew the answer wasn't inside. It was out there. The outer yard had been off limits since the collapse. That section of the prison stretched from the rec yard to the south seawall, about 300 yards of concrete, barbed wire, and rusted towers. It included the vehicle depot, an old outbuilding where deliveries used to be processed, and the pier. Long ago, boats had brought in food, fuel, and occasionally, inmates too high profile for a helicopter. When the outbreak happened, that pier became a graveyard. Fires had torn through the east end. We never investigated. Now I needed to know what was left. I took 2 of my enforcers and 3 laborers, all armed, and opened the east barricade just after dawn. The gate groaned as we dragged the chain aside. The concrete beyond was cracked and covered in weeds, but the layout was familiar. I'd done time walking that yard when it was still operational, when guards still barked orders and the towers had working spotlights. Now it was silent. The towers were black, the lights long dead. The place smelled like rust and salt water. A layer of ash still clung to the far end, blown in from the pier fires. We moved slowly, checking the vehicles first. There were 3 left behind in the motor depot, 2 cargo carts, and 1 flatbed truck, all electric. None of them worked. Stripped batteries, corroded wiring. Animals had chewed through most of the insulation. One had blood smeared on the interior windows, dried to a flaky rust color. We didn't dwell. Closer to the pier, we found the boats. 4 of them, weather-beaten, tilted on old trailers. One was burnt nearly to the frame. Another half sunk in the shallow tidal trench beside the dock. That left 2 motorized launches and a plastic skiff still intact. The motors were salvageable. The hulls had cracks, but nothing we couldn't patch with epoxy and scrap. I assigned a crew to begin cleaning the dock and checking fuel stores. We found 3 sealed drums in a locked shed, still safe. Diesel, enough for 2 or 3 short runs if rationed correctly. We moved them to a secured cage inside the wall and posted a permanent guard. That same day, I had the 2 best mechanics pulled from cleanup duty and reassigned to repair the launches. They protested at first, wanted tools we didn't have, access we couldn't give. I made it clear. If the boats didn't float within 10 days, they'd be tied to one and pushed into the tide themselves. Progress followed quickly after that. The pier itself had to be stripped. Charred boards were pulled out, and the steel pilings underneath reinforced with scrap from the motor pool. We scavenged life vests, rope and flares from the old guardhouse. One of the towers still had a functioning spotlight bulb. I marked it for future use. But as always, expansion brought risk, not just from the outside, but from within. By day, 146, one of the kitchen runners, a skinny, nervous man named Keller, had been spotted trying to pass notes between storage workers and 2 guards posted near the dock. I didn't like secrets. We pulled him aside and had him explain himself. He cracked under pressure and gave up the plan. A mutiny. 6 men, maybe 7. They believed the boats gave them a way out, that if they could get off the island, maybe the mainland was better. Maybe there were survivors. Maybe there was civilization. Hope made men stupid. They didn't realize that leaving wasn't an option anymore. Out there wasn't safer. It was just bigger. The mutineers waited until the night of the first engine test. They made their move under cloud cover, cutting the lines to the outer power relay and forcing open the padlock on launch 2. What they didn't know was that I had already rotated the fuel out of the tank and replaced it with seawater. A precaution. Never give a man a loaded escape route. We caught them 20 minutes later. 2 tried to swim after the skiff. 1 drowned in the surf. The other made it 30 yards before we dragged him back out with a grappling hook. The remaining 5 were hauled to the pier, cuffed, and lined up in front of the entire work detail. I made them kneel. No speeches, no threats, just one warning. You run, I told the others. You rot. Then I had their hands nailed to the planks, one by one, through the palms, between the bones, iron spikes driven into the wood. No one screamed more than once. We left them there until morning, then cut them loose and threw the corpses into the sea. After that, nobody tried to leave. With discipline reinforced, the boat repairs moved forward. Launch 1's motor roared to life on day 151. The skiff floated the next morning. I set up a dry dock inside the seawall courtyard and had the fuel barrels moved into locked cages under armed supervision. From that point on, only I decided when the boats were launched, who went and why. No speculation, no exceptions. We started collecting fish traps and building crude nets from shredded uniform fabric and old mop handles. A few of the older inmates had experience fishing, some commercial, some not exactly legal. They began training the younger ones. It wasn't much, but we pulled enough seaweed and crab to make broth. Belle turned it into soup with old bouillon cubes. It tasted like salt and iron. No one complained. From the top of the main tower, I could see beyond the waterline. Nothing but ocean. The mainland coast shimmered on the horizon, a smear of grey hills and dead treetops. Sometimes smoke drifted up from behind the hills. Fires left to burn. No ships, no planes, just birds. Thousands of them, circling the forests, waiting. Inside Blackridge, things were holding. Outside, there was only the unknown. The boats gave us reach, but they also gave us exposure. We had options, but also risk. And as every man on this island now understood, risk carried a cost. We used the launches carefully. Small runs to nearby islets, wreckage along the shoreline, old fishing traps where seabirds circled and lingered. We scouted for washed-up debris after storms, sometimes pulled back sealed crates or shredded life vests. Once we brought in a medical supply container, ruined by salt water, but inside we found surgical clamps, wound dressings, a few sealed blister packs of painkillers. Each trip was weighed by what we could afford to lose. Fuel, time, men. I never let sentiment get in the way of math. 600 days after the world ended, almost 2 full years of ash, rust, and rot, we woke to the sound of the wind howling across the yard. A storm had begun rolling in from the southeast during the night, building slowly, clawing at the tide like it wanted to rip the whole island loose. We shut down the boats, chained the tower doors, reinforced the seawall gates. Then, just past noon, the tower lookout shouted something I hadn't heard in months. "Ship." He pointed through the rain and salt mist. I climbed up myself and trained the long lens scope across the grey water. It took a few seconds to focus, but there it was. A container ship. Large, low in the water. The hull was scarred and blackened. The paint was stripped from the bow, and its name had been crossed out with spray paint. I counted at least 5 upper deck containers welded into a central structure, with what looked like steel paneling wrapped around the sides like makeshift armor. Tarps covered some sections, shredded and flapping like torn flags. The whole thing pitched with the tide and scraped against the outer reef. It had run aground hard. No anchor, no navigation lights. But in the upper tower structure near the bridge, I saw movement, flashes of light, silhouettes pacing behind broken glass. For a moment I thought it was the infected. Then we saw it. Morse, firelight, a mirror signal in the old language. Alive. The men around me leaned forward, whispering. Some said it was rescue. Others said it was a trap. I stayed quiet. Survival had taught me that most things too good to be true usually are. Still, we needed to know. If they had supplies, weapons, even scrap metal, anything we couldn't fabricate ourselves, it would buy us months. By nightfall, the wind began to ease. The ship stayed lodged in the reef, tilted slightly, the tide pulling debris off its stern. Oil, plastic crates, a lifeboat half inflated and upside down. We waited until morning, posted armed guards all along the seawall, and loaded Launch 1 with a team of 6. 2 mechanics, 1 former Coast Guard prisoner, 2 enforcers, and myself. We motored out just after sunrise. The water was choppy but manageable. The closer we got, the more obvious the damage became. The side of the ship had been hit with small arms fire, shell holes in the cargo panels, burn marks near the upper deck. One of the welded barricades had collapsed, exposing twisted railings and cots bolted into the wall. There had been people here. Dozens. Maybe more. Not anymore. We tied off at a rear loading ladder that hung just above the tide line. I climbed first. The upper deck smelled like sewage and gunpowder. The walls were charred in places, smeared in dried blood in others. Spent casings littered the stairwell, mostly 9mm and 223. There had been a firefight up here, prolonged, messy, and desperate. We passed 3 bodies in the first hallway. One had been bludgeoned. The others shot at close range. No sign of infection. They'd killed each other. Inside one of the side cabins, we found what remained of the signal crew. 2 people in torn vests slumped beside a broken antenna panel. One had bled out from a gut wound. The other had handwritten notes scattered across the floor. I picked up the top sheet and scanned it. Maps, trade routes, lists of ration supplies. At the top, in thick red ink, "Do not allow entry if symptomatic." It didn't take long to understand. This wasn't just a ship. It had been a floating refuge. A fortress cobbled together by survivors, likely ex-military or private security, dragging along desperate civilians in exchange for labor or goods. Somewhere along the line, the infection got in. Someone turned, food ran out, order collapsed. We split up and scouted the rest. Found 2 sealed storage lockers on the lower cargo deck. One filled with survival kits, emergency radios, tarps, wind-up lanterns, iodine tablets. The other with food, cans, vacuum-packed flour, powdered eggs. A third locker had tools, hammers, wrenches, even a functional welder. That alone was worth the trip. On the medical deck, we found a single survivor. She was locked inside a cold storage room, wrapped in a thermal blanket, one arm covered in makeshift bandages. Maybe late 20s, face covered in soot. Her name was Lena. She didn't speak much, but what she said confirmed what we suspected. The ship had been run by a coalition of mercs and engineers, picked up survivors along the coast, charged them food and labor to stay. Over time, factions formed. A raid on shore brought back a wounded man. He turned on the ship. Bit 2. Within a week, a third of them were infected. One side wanted to quarantine. The other wanted to kill everyone exposed. A fight broke out. Fire, gunshots, explosions. In the chaos, someone ran the ship aground to stop it from drifting. No one made it out after that. She was the last, or at least the last who could speak. I radioed the prison, told them to prep the infirmary and quarantine chambers. We wrapped her in tarp, dosed her with antibiotics, and hauled her into the skiff. We spent another 4 hours clearing the deck, loading crates, hauling rope, and securing fuel drums. 3 men stayed behind to finish extraction. I took the launch back personally. Not all of them came back. The next night, one of the mechanics showed up at the seawall gate alone, face soaked in blood, hands trembling. The others had been ambushed below deck by something still alive, or something that had died differently. He never gave a clear answer, just said they made too much noise, went too deep. By morning, we saw the lifeboat drifting back, empty. We lost 2 men, but what we gained shifted everything. Fuel, food, radios, welding equipment, tools, a backup generator, a case of water purification tablets, a wind-up transceiver capable of shortwave transmission. I didn't care about the signals, but the parts alone were gold. I issued orders to strip the salvaged gear and move it into secure storage. The radios were boxed, the food sorted. The survivor, Lena, was kept isolated in the old drunk tank, guarded day and night. She was still weak. I didn't trust her story entirely, but I didn't throw her out either. The men were quiet after the run, not because of the death, but because they had seen something else out there, proof that we weren't alone, but also proof that whatever was left wasn't stable. It could be a ship, a town, a settlement, but if it wasn't protected, it turned on itself. Always, like a fire burning the fuel it depended on. Still, I let them talk in whispers, let them tell stories around their ration fires about what the ship had been, let them think they'd seen something mythic and survived it. That kind of awe made people compliant, but I didn't forget what really mattered. 2 men didn't come back. One returned too late, and the one who made it back wasn't whole. His name was Martin, 36 years old. Did 5 years in Attica before transfer. He'd been one of my best welders, sharp-minded, methodical. He helped rig the new gates at the East Yard. On the ship, he was assigned to lower cargo deck salvage, along with the 2 others who never returned. The night he came back, he was pale and breathing hard. I chalked it up to shock. He said little, just that they'd split up to follow cables through the hold. Something went wrong. He ran. The rest didn't. I believed him. 12 hours later, he developed a fever. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight tremble in his jaw, followed by sweating, confusion. He tried to eat and vomited. His pupils looked wrong, not blown wide, not drugged, just empty. When I questioned him again, he couldn't remember half the trip. Names, locations, even how he got back to the launch. It was like someone had shaken the hard drive loose in his skull. I ordered him pulled from duty and locked in the old laundry tunnel beneath Block B. It was sealed on both ends and lined with piping. We'd used it once to move supplies during the fire. Now it was perfect for containment. 2 guards outside, 24-hour rotation. No contact. No excuses. The rest of the scavenger team was quarantined in the wreck block, stripped of all gear, blood-tested and monitored. Some protested. One refused to comply and was knocked out with a pipe handle. I didn't flinch. We were a fortress, but only if the infection stayed on the outside. One leak, and everything we built was kindling. By hour 36, Martin stopped responding entirely. When the guards called me down, I didn't bring a medic. I brought a crowbar and ordered the outer door opened, while I watched from the steel catwalk above. He was curled in the far corner, head resting against a crate of bleach bottles, breathing slow and shallow. His skin had gone grey-blue, his fingernails darkened. When we called his name, he didn't answer. When we stepped closer, he lunged. His eyes were dead, mouth open like a trap, arms swinging wide. Not slow, not clumsy, desperate, animal. The guards closed the door before he reached them. He slammed into it with enough force to crack the viewing glass. I stepped forward, watched him through the window. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just paced, hit the wall again and again until his forehead split open and bled down his face. That wasn't Martin anymore. We waited until the blood stopped moving, then we opened the door and burned what was left. Word spread fast. The scavenger team's gear was torched, their sleeping quarters sterilized with bleach and fire. The wreck block was locked for 3 more days. Nobody turned. No one else showed symptoms. But the damage had already been done. Trust cracked. Eyes started watching too closely. Whispers started again. One of my lieutenants saw an opportunity. His name was Durant. He'd come from one of the inland prisons after transfer, ran a car theft ring before the outbreak. Smart enough to follow orders, dumb enough to think he could do better. He'd been waiting for a moment like this. One where fear was thicker than discipline, where questions outweighed the rules. I knew he was probing, heard it in the way he talked to the guards, asking what they'd do if I got sick, wondering aloud if the island had become too much for one man to control. Little phrases, carefully placed. He thought he was clever, thought I wouldn't hear, but rats always leave tracks. Then he made his move. The guard posted at the laundry tunnel didn't show for rotation. That never happened. I sent 2 men down and found the hatch unlocked. The body inside wasn't Martin. It was Brenner, one of the kitchen runners. Face chewed out, throat torn sideways. The infected was gone. No drag marks, no blood trail. He hadn't escaped. He'd been let out. Durant had planned it with 5 others. Open the hatch, release the infected into the south hallway, trigger panic. During the chaos, they'd take over the food stores, lock down the wreck area, and declare themselves the new leadership. They thought it would unravel quickly, that people would pick safety over loyalty. They thought wrong. We caught 2 of his men near the kitchens, hiding behind the water tanks with makeshift blades. A third tried to flee through the delivery tunnel and was crushed by a fire door when we sealed it. The last 2 never made it past the infirmary. The infected they'd released found them first. When we arrived, we found all 3 in a pile. 1 torn open, 1 twitching, 1 dead again. Durant was the twitching one. I didn't let him turn. We pulled him out, dragged him down into the sewage processing channel beneath the north wall, an old filtration trench we'd stopped using 6 months ago. There, with only the smell of rot and rusted pipework for company, I beat him to death with a length of corroded conduit and dropped his body into the drainage basin. Then I sealed the hatch. The others, the ones who followed him, were brought to the same tunnel. No food, no light. I left them there with only a single lantern, a bucket of water, and the knowledge that they weren't worth a bullet. I tightened the ranks, doubled security around quarantine procedures. Anyone who left the island again, salvage, recon, fishing, was locked in isolation for 2 days upon return. No exceptions, not even the mechanics. Blood checks every 12 hours, fever logs, pulse readings. 1 strike, and they were marked for burial. Lena, the survivor from the cargo ship, remained symptom-free. She stayed locked in the infirmary wing, under watch. Eventually, she began helping Belle with triage, splitting bandages, prepping medicine, staying out of sight. She spoke little, but she didn't resist. I didn't trust her, but she did her part. And for now, that was enough. By day 610, the prison was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after violence. Not peace, but pause. Men looked at each other differently. They measured each other in symptoms, in distance. The infection hadn't just thinned our numbers, it had eaten something deeper, something between the ribs of the place. But fear doesn't last forever, not when men still need to eat, or sleep, or dig new graves. By day 700, Blackridge was no longer a dead prison. It was a functioning settlement, or at least the bones of one. The yard was sectioned off with garden rows, raised beds built from broken bunk frames and old laundry carts. Turned soil produced radishes, beans, potatoes. The cooks knew how to boil anything edible, and we'd found seeds sealed in foil packets in the old commissary office. Belle said it would never feed us all, but I didn't ask it to. It was about control, not calories. The guards' towers were manned again, not with rifles, but with rebar spears, salvaged optics, and watch lists carved into wood panels. Every corridor had a checkpoint. Every roof had a runner. I knew where every man was supposed to be. And when he wasn't, I made an example of it. Routine replaced fear, and routine made room for reach. The boats became more than tools. They became leverage. We started with the small islets, bare rock, bird shit, maybe a wrecked shack or a buoy tower. Once, we found an old Coast Guard shed with a solar charger and a weather radio still blinking green. Nothing useful on the channels, but the charger worked. We brought it back. After that, we mapped a radius, 10 nautical miles from the Blackridge docks. It was slow. Weather slowed us. Tides shifted debris, hulls fouled with seaweed. But we kept moving. 3-man crews, always armed, always ready to cut and run. We used signal flags when the radios failed. Every return trip was searched, blood-tested, watched. Still, I sent them, because every piece we found added to the puzzle I was building. A fortress doesn't stand without walls, but walls are nothing without eyes beyond them. One crew came back with salvaged diving suits from a wrecked training barge. Another returned with 5 rolls of copper wiring and a working depth gauge. It wasn't about treasure, it was about infrastructure. We reconnected the wind turbines near the south promontory, patched solar arrays on the chapel roof, ran crude distillers from broken kitchen sinks. Belle designed a manual pump system for water, pressure-driven, low maintenance. Lena oversaw canning and brining from fish hauls. She didn't speak to me directly, but she didn't hide anymore. I let her be. She did more with jars and vinegar than any of the lifers who still thought canned beans grew on trees. But the more we ventured out, the more we saw, and not all of it was salvage. One team passed a fog bank to the northeast. When it cleared, they spotted campfires on the mainland. Not signal fires, controlled burns, spaced, measured, like someone was clearing brush, scouting a perimeter. Another group swore they saw drone movement over an old refinery, silent, black-bodied, hovering at low altitude. No sound, just the shimmer of glass and faint buzz before it veered inland. They reported it with shaking hands. We never found it again. It wasn't just signals. There were ships, not tankers, not navy. Civilian hulls rigged with sheet metal, tower scaffolds, and rigging chains like armor. Twice we saw one pass in the distance at dusk. No lights, no engine noise, just silhouette and wake. I forbade pursuit, let the ghosts pass. Curiosity was never free. The real change came on day 741. Boat 4 didn't return. It had been a 3-man team, Gorecki, Marlin, and Den, all dependable, none likely to mutiny. They'd been assigned a run towards South Channel Island, a small landmass with a ferry station, part of the old inmate processing route from before the collapse, supposed to be empty, used to store extra fuel drums. Radio contact stopped an hour after launch. No flares, no reply. We waited through the tide change. Nothing. On day 743, one of our skiffs returned under oar, bleeding wake across the water. Inside was Den. He was dehydrated, burned across the face, and missing 3 fingers on his left hand. The boat had a hole patched with a prison blanket and half a cooler lid. He didn't speak until he was fed and given morphine. What he told us was worse than losing the crew. They never made it to South Channel. The currents had shifted, and they were forced toward the mainland, landing near a port city. Delwick, small commercial hub before the fall. Roads in, but only one way out by boat. When they tried to leave, they were spotted. Den said there were people there, survivors, at least 100, but they weren't normal, covered in rags, barefoot, armed with clubs, machetes, sharpened wire. Not infected, just empty. No language, no reasoning. They hunted the boats like prey. Den saw them rip Gorecki apart on the dock. Marlin tried to fight and vanished in the mob. Den only escaped by diving under a sewage outfall and floating until he reached the bay mouth. He called it a dead funnel, said if anyone went in, they wouldn't get back out. I didn't doubt him. We shut down all mainland excursions for 6 days. Den's report changed the map. Delwick was no longer a salvage route. It was an infection vector, not biologically, but behaviorally. A warning of what hunger and isolation could do to people long after the sickness passed them by. I reviewed our intake, counted bodies, looked at stores, estimated burn rates on fuel, grain, salt, ammo. We had enough for winter, but only if we didn't grow. For weeks, I stared at the eastern charts and saw possibility. Ports, towers, farmland, machine shops. But after Den's report, all I saw was collapse. Every structure out there would eat its own, sooner or later, and any survivor who came knocking now would not be the kind we could use. That night, I walked the perimeter alone and looked at the fences, the barricades, the watchposts. The outer wall still held. The boats still floated. The gardens still produced. We weren't an expedition anymore. We weren't scouts or colonists. We were something else, something quieter. Blackridge wasn't the edge of something larger. It was the last bastion of something smaller, a perimeter without ambition, a wall against contagion, not just the flesh kind, the human kind, the chaos. I made the call the next morning. No more outreach, no more expansion, no more scouting beyond 5 miles. All operations redirected toward internal strengthening, tools, food, weatherproofing, defense. At first, the order held. Most of the men welcomed the decision. Less exposure, fewer risks. The boats remained docked, checked weekly, their fuel rationed and locked under guard. Weapons were re-inventoried and redistributed based on seniority and compliance. Construction shifted inward. We reinforced the chapel roof, doubled the inner yard fencing, reworked our storage protocols. The winter winds were already rolling across the water, and I was more interested in warm pipes and dry ceilings than whatever waited on the mainland. But I knew that kind of order wouldn't last forever. When fear is the glue that holds a structure together and that fear starts to dull, men look for cracks, they ask questions, they get curious. And curiosity in a place like this, that's a disease you can't quarantine. It started with whispers, late conversations on the chapel benches, men talking in code while shoveling compost, small symbols drawn into the back walls of cells, triangles, half moons, marks that didn't belong to any of the gangs. Someone had begun testing the seams. I let it go on longer than I should have, not because I was weak, because I wanted names, and because I wanted the instigator to believe he was clever. His name was Whitaker, Ronald Whitaker, former petty officer in the Navy, assigned to a radar frigate out of Norfolk before the fall, one of the few new bodies we'd accepted during the salvage window. He'd been picked up by the team that found that half-sunken ferry past the channel edge, starving, frostbitten, but still upright. We patched him up, let him sweep floors. Later, he earned light watch duty. A few of the men respected him, military, sober, smart with his hands, good with repairs. That was my mistake. By the time I learned what he was organizing, it had already spread. Not an uprising, not yet, but something worse in the long term, a philosophy. He'd been holding meetings, quiet ones, in the old armory wing under the pretense of cataloging parts, preaching ideas he called foundations of civic life, talk of democracy, of elections, of shared leadership, even used that word, civilization, as if that place had any claim to it left. He'd drawn comparisons between what we had built and regimes from history, said we could do better, that fear wasn't sustainable, that men needed voice. What they needed was structure, what they needed was to survive. I didn't argue, I didn't respond, I waited. One night, I had his meetings disrupted by dogs, 2 pit mixes we'd raised in the yard after finding them on the lighthouse route, hungry, controlled, mean when directed. I sent them in through the side hatch while Whitaker and 4 others were inside. The others fled, One didn't make it far. Gibson. The dogs tore into him before anyone could help. We let the body rot in the yard for 2 days as a warning, not to discourage defiance, to test it. The real message came next. I had Whitaker brought to the old death chamber. It wasn't operational anymore, hadn't been for years before the outbreak. The wiring had corroded, the copper stolen, the generators stripped for parts during the blackout months. But the chair still stood, bolted to the floor in a windowless room that reeked of rust and bleach. The leather straps had been chewed by mice. I replaced them with braided wire. He didn't scream when we bound him. He asked why. Calm. I told him this wasn't punishment. It was instruction. And if he wanted to preach civilization, I'd give him the lesson he clearly missed. What civilization really costs. I had 2 of my men bring in torches, cutting torches from the repair shop. We didn't light them at first. We just let the heat from the tanks hiss while I walked in circles and told the truth. There is no vote that stops hunger, no policy that keeps the dead out of your gates, no negotiation with entropy. There is only function. There is only control. He said nothing, didn't blink. I respected that. Still, I lit the torch. Didn't touch him with it. Didn't need to. I let it sing against the old steel frame, let it warp the air around his feet. The smell of heated iron filled the chamber like incense from an altar. I spoke of fire, of structure, of the need for singular vision, of the stakes. You want civilization, I told him, then you do what it takes to keep it alive. I cut the wire on one of the restraints and left him alone in that room with the torch burning against the wall. We sealed the outer door. He was found hours later, still alive, silent, unbound, but different. Whatever protest had been in him was gone. He never spoke of elections again. Word spread, fast, not just of the dogs, not just of the chair, but of the meaning behind it. Some said I was a tyrant. Some said I was a savior. All of them obeyed. That was the point. I didn't erase Whitaker. I kept him alive. He still worked repairs, still sat through briefings, but his eyes stopped meeting others. He became a ghost among the living, constant, present, silent. His punishment hadn't been death. It had been purpose, stripped of delusion. The others, the ones who followed him, faded back into the machine. 2 were reassigned to sewage cleanout. 1 vanished entirely. I didn't ask where. Lena handled rotations. She never asked questions she didn't want answers to. By day 790, the revolt was gone. The seeds had dried in the dirt, burned before they could take root. Order returned, but it was tighter now, meaner. I began holding morning drills again, head counts, response calls, patrol inspections. Tools had to be signed out. Guards rotated in pairs. No one moved between wings without a writ. Food rations were tethered to task compliance. It had been a long time since I'd spoken to all of them at once. I usually addressed my men in fragments, wing by wing, patrol by patrol, one situation at a time. This was different. I had Lena call every active body to the central yard just after morning drills. We cleared the space of tools, kept the guard towers manned, and stationed 2 armed sentries at each gate. The wind coming off the water carried that salty bite that clung to everything here. But the sun was sharp and the yard was dry. Men gathered in loose clusters, watching me from under hoods and caps, some leaning on shovels, others standing with arms crossed. I waited until I was sure every face that mattered was present. When I spoke, I didn't pace, I didn't shout, I just told them the truth. I told them this prison had changed me, the same way it had changed the world beyond these walls. I wasn't the man who first walked into this block when the outbreak was fresh. None of us were. The infection had burned off everything that wasn't hard enough to last. I said my methods had been cruel, deliberately cruel, but that cruelty was the only reason they were still here, still breathing, still under a roof with full bellies while the mainland rotted in the wind. I told them I was giving them something I hadn't given in a long time, a chance to speak their minds without fear of what came after. The yard stayed quiet for a moment. Men looked at each other, testing if this was real. Then the first voice came. a lifer from Sea Wing who had worked the gardens since we started them. He said I was a hard bastard, but he still had a place to sleep and food to eat, more than he ever had before the world fell apart. Another joined in, a former dock worker who'd been part of the salvage crews, saying that I might be harsh, but at least I never lied about what I was doing. Others weren't so generous. One called me a tyrant outright. Another said I was no better than the men we used to keep in solitary, that I ruled through fear and blood, and that sooner or later it would be my turn under the dogs. Their words didn't raise the volume in the yard, but I saw heads nodding in pockets. Dissatisfaction wasn't gone. It had just been quiet until now. I answered them with facts. I reminded them that they weren't farmers, or school teachers, or innocent civilians. Most of them had been murderers, thieves, extortionists, traffickers. Men who had already crossed lines before the outbreak took the rest of the world away. I told them that no matter what they thought of me, my rules kept the walls intact, kept the boats in our control, kept the infected on the other side of the fence instead of tearing into the yard while we slept. Without that order, we'd be nothing but bones in the mud like everyone else who thought fair mattered more than alive. Then I gave them a choice. Anyone who wanted to leave the island and the prison forever could go. No punishment, no pursuit, but no return. If they wanted freedom, they could take it now, and they'd get a boat to the mainland with enough fuel and supplies to make their own way. The decision had to be made here and now. The yard went quiet again. Eyes moved between the towers, the gates, me. Eventually, 4 men stepped forward. 2 I expected, troublemakers who'd never adapted to the structure. The other 2 surprised me. They didn't look defiant, just tired. They didn't say much, just that they'd rather take their chances inland. I told them the launch would be ready at first light. Lena stayed back through the whole thing, arms folded, her expression unreadable. When I finally asked her, in front of everyone, she said she didn't agree with most of what I'd done. She didn't like my methods, didn't like the executions, or the way discipline was kept with a blade. But she wasn't leaving. She was alive, and no one was bothering her. That was enough. I told them one more thing. From this point forward, I wanted 3 representatives, chosen without my input, to speak for the rest. They would come to me with problems, needs, and ideas. I would listen, and I would try to solve what I could without going straight to the harshest measures. But the final word would always be mine. This was still my island, my walls, my rules. There was no applause, no jeering either, just men thinking, weighing the offer against what they knew of me. By the end of the day, the 3 names were chosen. Not men I trusted, but men who could keep the rest of them quiet enough to work. The next morning, I stood on the pier as the 4 who had chosen to leave boarded the launch. None looked back. I didn't expect them to. The boat pushed off into the grey chop, the motor carrying them toward the mainland until they were just a shadow against the mist. When they were gone, I turned and walked back to the gate. The yard was waiting, drills still ahead of schedule. Discipline intact. For now. We opened the count at first light, not because daylight mattered, but because rhythm mattered. The whistle echoed off the brick like it had when this place still had a warden. Only now the men formed ranks without shouting or pushing. They knew the marks painted on the concrete and where to stand on them. Heads up, hands visible, blankets folded behind the second line. Tools checked into their cages the night before were presented again. Shovels, crowbars, bolt cutters, clean and tagged with wire ties that matched the day's color. I stood with my back to the chapel and watched the blocks empty in sequence. C first, then D, then the infirmary detail, and kitchen staff. We kept the psychiatric corridor sealed and counted it as dead space on the roster. Anyone not assigned to that wing didn't ask questions about it anymore. Questions were luxuries the old world could afford. The representatives, 3 men chosen without my hand on the scales, stood off to the side with clipboards I'd salvaged from the ferry station. They had lists of requests, new boots for the tower guard who had worn through his soles, more vinegar for Lena's canning jars, extra blankets for the night detail. Nothing extravagant, nothing that made the walls softer. They had learned the boundaries of possibility the same way I had. By pushing against them and feeling the concrete hold, I took the lists without comment, folded them in half, and told them where to stand during inspections. The final word stayed where it belonged. We marched the line past the food bins. Bell and Shaw had turned the kitchen into a quiet engine. The clatter of ladles, the steady hiss of the burners, the scrape of knives on plastic cutting boards, all of it sounded like something alive and dependable. The old freezer we'd coaxed back into partial service thumped like a slow heart. Jars stood stacked in rows, fish, greens, broth, each sealed with wax and labeled with dates scratched in black marker. From the kitchen I cut through the corridor toward the towers. The air had the sting of salt and metal, and a thin film of grit clung to everything the wind touched. The South Tower watchman raised a hand in acknowledgement before returning to his scope. He had been a burglar on the outside, a quiet climber who once moved across rooftops like a cat. Now he kept notes on weather and tide tables and circled days on a board when the currents worked in our favor. He didn't ask to go out on the boats anymore. Nobody did, unless ordered. The lesson of the cargo ship had sunk deeper than any sermon I could have delivered. In the yard, the gardens were still there, rectangles of dark soil hemmed with scrap metal frames, weeded by men who once fought over cigarettes and now argued in low voices about which rows caught more sun. Potatoes did better by the chapel wall. The beans liked the runoff from the old gutter spouts. We composted everything that didn't poison us. We boiled what might. I paused near a row of radishes and watched a man kneel to pull a clump of dandelion from the soil. He shook it clean, sniffed the leaves, and set it carefully in a bucket marked edible. He had been a robber on the outside. Here he moved with the care of a surgeon. The guards weren't guards in the old sense. They were the ones who could run toward noise without freezing. Men who had learned to sweep corners and keep their backs to brick when doors opened. Some had been killers before the outbreak. Most had at least rehearsed the part. The difference now was direction. They wore armbands cut from red tarp and carried batons wrapped in cloth to keep the grip from slipping. At inspection, they laid everything on the table for me. Batons, the 2 shotguns rebuilt from parts, the last box of buckshot shells we never touched unless the fence line shook in ways that didn't sound human, and the flares we used to turn night into a warning. Order didn't live in the weapons. It lived in the certainty that the weapons belonged to the structure, not the hands holding them. The structure was me. We held a brief check at the boats. The launches were tarped and chained. The skiff rode a few inches higher in the water since we stopped pushing it into the channel, unless storms left debris worth the fuel. The dock still bore the scars from the mutiny months back, dark stains between the planks where iron had met wood. I walked to the end of the pier and stood long enough to feel the swell beneath my boots. Gulls wheeled above the reef, the only things that treated the island like it had always been here, unchanged. On a clear day, we could trace the contour of the mainland and the cut where the port city bled into sea haze. We didn't send spotters to the ridge anymore. We didn't need to. If something large came, the water told us first. The representatives caught up to me at the pier gate, and we did the quick business of leadership. They asked for supplies. I recited numbers and gave them what fit inside the margins. One asked about the 4 who had left. I told him the truth. The sea doesn't answer questions we don't need answered. He accepted that without a second look. I watched him go and thought about the men who used to call this place a cage. The word no longer fit. Cages are small. Cages have owners with keys. Blackridge had become a shape that matched us. Nothing pretty, nothing soft, but large enough to move around inside without losing the perimeter. I walked the cell block next. The long tiers smelled like old rain and clean wool. Doors stood open during the day, locked at night. Beds were stripped and folded to regulation squares. Shoes lined beneath cots with toes pointed inward. The sound of this place was no longer fighting or pleading. It was footfalls in unison, and tools being set down carefully. The way men handle objects they must use again tomorrow. I paused at a cell where a map of the coast had been drawn on the back wall in charcoal. Someone had marked a dozen crosses along the shoreline with numbers and dates. Landings, searches, losses. The final cross had no date next to it. The chalk had been rubbed away. Whoever lived here had decided the ledger no longer needed new entries. At the infirmary, Lena supervised a rotation of men who used to be good at breaking things, and were now competent at keeping them attached. She moved between bunks with a clipboard, checking the healed line of a wound here, measuring out tablets there, watching eyes for the early signs of the sickness we could not afford to miss. She acknowledged me with the tilt of her chin and kept working. She had been clear at the gathering. She didn't like the way I held this place together, but she would not leave what she had made. We understood each other without conversation. She wanted stability without illusions, and I offered nothing else. I kept moving, past the laundry where lines of clean fabric hung in the warm air and the drip of rinse water tapped the floor in a steady rhythm, through the chapel that no longer served its original purpose but gave shade to men who needed 30 breaths in silence before going back to the yard, over the causeway to the administrative wing where file cabinets sat gutted and binders had been stripped for their rings. The warden's office had become a parts room with neat rows of labeled bins. A plaque with his name still bolted above the door had been turned upside down long ago, maybe by a guard who left in a hurry, maybe by a wind that did not care about names. Every corner of the main structure was ours by habit as much as by claim. Doors opened because hands opened them every day. Lights glowed because men cranked the generator and watched the gauges. The fences stood because we walked them and tightened wire where it sagged. All of it depended on effort. All of it depended on fear too, but a measured kind, the sort that checks the latch twice and keeps water at a simmer instead of a boil. This place had started as punishment. It ended as discipline. I made one last sweep of the fence line. The psychiatric wing was unchanged, bolted, sealed, marked with danger symbols we had drawn without thinking too hard about their accuracy. Every now and then, something knocked from the far side, but distance and steel kept it abstract. We had long since learned that the things we locked away needed no attention once the locks held. If that was optimism, it was the only kind we could afford. By then, the sun was high enough to cut the chill out of the yard, and the men drifted back to their stations. The morning count went into the ledger. The representatives took their notes to distribute. The guards started the afternoon rotation. None of it required my voice. That was the point. I could have stayed on the catwalk and watched it all move like a clock. Instead, I turned down a quiet hallway and walked toward the place where my world had ended and begun in the same hour. Solitary B4 waited at the end of a corridor that the wind rarely reached. Paint flaked from the corners in long curls. The hum of the lights was lower here, almost a drone. I passed 3 cells whose numbers I remembered by the shape of the scratches near the locks. In one, an old metal tray leaned against the wall like a relic. In another, a tiny calendar was etched into cinder block, the last line crossing over into empty space as if the hand that made it had run out of days. None of it surprised me. Nothing in this wing knew how to lie. My door stood open. It felt wrong to think of it as mine, and also correct in a way that did not ask permission. A rectangle of dim light sliced across the floor, and dust hung in it like slow rain. The slab was still there, the stainless toilet, the vent that had carried voices when I had nothing else to listen to. The smell was the same, damp stone and a memory of bleach. I stepped in without ceremony and sat on the slab with my back to the wall. The air felt colder here, not because it was, but because it held still. Outside, the machine of the prison moved on without me. Boots on gravel, low conversations, a gate clanging as it latched. All the sounds were proof that nothing I had built depended on my shadow crossing the yard at every hour. That was the only kind of permanence available to men like me. I thought about the gala in Miami that had set my sentence. I thought about the way plans fracture when the first variable slips. I thought about the men who had tried to make a ship into a city and ended with smoke and screams. I thought about the guard who had written "Nobody is coming" outside this wing when the radios went dark. Every one of those sentences had been true enough. Every one of them had created a new reality the moment it was spoken aloud. We pretended we recorded what happened. Really, we gave it orders. And then we obeyed. At some point, Lena appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard her steps, which told me how deep the memory of this room reached. She didn't enter. She leaned a shoulder against the jamb and said the afternoon jars were sealing fine and Belle wanted to adjust the vinegar ratio. Then she asked if I planned to close the door. I told her it would stay open. She nodded once and left. I listened to the echo fade and realized that was as close to peace as this place could provide. News about jars, ratios, and a door I chose not to close. I stayed until the light shifted across the floor and the dust changed its pattern. Outside, the second rotation whistle blew. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. The sea pressed against the breakwater with a sound like breathing through cloth. It occurred to me that the island might outlast all of us the way ruins outlast their builders, not by strength, but by indifference. It was a simple thought, undramatic and correct. Before I stood, I set my palms on the cool concrete and let my eyes trace the outlines of the room. The slab, the hatch, the vent, the door's edge. A geometry of limits that had drawn the wider shape of my rule. Men like to think freedom lives in open fields and unmarked roads. For some it does. For me, freedom had turned out to be the knowledge of every lock and hinge and the certainty of who held the keys. I walked back into the hall without closing the door. The corridor swallowed my steps and gave them back softly. When I reached the yard, the shadows had lengthened just enough to turn faces into shapes. The count for evening would come soon, then the securing of doors, the clatter of bins, the hiss of stoves. Another day of breath measured and accounted for. If tomorrow brought wind, we would brace the gates. If it brought calm, we would fix more things. If it brought noise from the psychiatric wing, we would add weight to the bolts. None of it required imagination, only resolve. I looked across the yard at what the prison used to be. Blocks of stone meant to hold people still, and what it had become. Blocks of stone that moved because we moved them. The new guards were men who had done worse things than guards had any right to admit. The rules were mine, and they worked because I kept say over the moment when exceptions tempted people into ruin. There was no music here. There were no speeches. There was only the reliable sound of a place that functioned because it remembered what failure had cost. I didn't bother with a final address. The men didn't need words to know what I already knew. Tomorrow would look like today if I held the line. If it didn't, we would do what we had always done, narrow the perimeter until it matched the size of our strength, and press forward in that smaller space until it belonged to us again. This place was made to cage monsters, but you leave anything here long enough, and it learns how to rule. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.